The film opens with a view of a mansion under construction in California, 1906. The construction workers are working day and night without stopping. One night, inside a bedroom, a boy named Henry is sleeping together with his mom, Marion. The boy is startled awake by the sound of a man's sinister singing. The sound of the enormous bell ringing startles the woman awake. She appears astonished to discover that the boy is no longer lying next to her on the bed, and she searches the corridors. When she approaches the corner of the corridor, she notices a little figure with a sack over their head and attempts to call her son numerous times, in vain. She then approaches her kid and removes his mask. When he gestures to the top of the stairs, Henry's eyes become white and eventually return to normal. Beyond the ceiling, we can hear heavy footsteps and wood cracking in the background. Early in the morning, we are shown a view of a fancy-looking neighborhood in San Francisco. A lady and a man are speaking in one of the houses while high on a medication. Eric Price is the man's name, and he is a highly famous psychic doctor. He goes on to explain to the woman how the mind may create illusions, and how certain individuals may require assistance in distinguishing between reality and illusion. Later, the doctor hears many knocks on the door, followed by a well-dressed guy who says he is seeking Dr. Price. The stranger pretends to be offering the doctor a job, and then tells him about Mrs. Sarah Winchester. She is the widow of the late Mr. William Winchester, the inventor and owner of Winchester firearms. Mr. Winchester left his wife half of his business. The guy informs the doctor that Mrs. Winchester has lost her daughter and, in her grief, has resorted to mediums who may be taking advantage of her. According to the gentleman, Mrs. Winchester relocated to an 8-bedroom mansion in San Jose and has spent the last 20 years building it. The house is like a maze and is constantly under construction, created according to the grieving widow's orders. Knowing this, the board of directors of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company feels compelled to send someone to determine the state of Mrs. Winchester's mental health, in order to determine whether or not she is qualified to lead the business. The man responds that he is just concerned about the lady's mental condition. When the doctor asks whether they intend to take over the business, the doctor is subsequently informed that Mrs. Winchester has consented to let him remain at her home. As he learns how much money he will receive, he decides to accept the offer, after some initial hesitation. Finally accepting the offer, Dr. Eric drives off in a carriage. He arrives to the view of a huge, luxurious mansion surrounded by construction workers. The majority of rooms don't remain unchanged for very long. According to one worker, and construction workers are there day and night. The wind blows through the office window forcefully. While the doctor waits inside, tossing a few pieces of paper to the floor, Price approaches the moving window, which the housekeeper is later revealed to be cleaning. A little while later, Marion Marriott, who claims to be Mrs. Winchester's niece, enters the room. She instructs him to remain in the east wing of the home, and to keep Mrs. Winchester undisturbed. Every visitor is barred from carrying a gun, as part of the house rule. She leads him to his room, while warning him that the home has over 100 rooms, and it's easy to become disoriented. The physician discovers a wall panel with small holes labeled with room names. Marion explains to him that each hole will allow one's voice to echo into the appropriate room. She warns him before she leaves that Sarah Winchester would not want for him to drink before supper, since she can smell the alcohol on his breath. Later on in the day, as he prepares for dinner with Mrs. Winchester, the doctor is taking his favorite medication for relaxation. On the table, a locket with a photograph of a blonde woman inside is open. He calls her Ruby. The mirror moves to a vacant chair behind the doctor as he turns his head away. When he turns the mirror, an unsettling man's face emerges from behind the mirror. He dismisses what he witnessed as a hallucination, since he doesn't want to believe it. When Dr. Price opens the door to depart, he is startled to see a butler standing there, telling him that dinner is about to begin in 10 minutes. Dr. Price, Marion, and Henry wait for Sarah Winchester to appear at the dinner table. Henry informs Dr. Price that after his father passed away, he and his mother moved into the house, in an effort to empathize. The doctor tells Henry that he shares Henry's feelings because he recently lost someone too. The three guests rise to greet the woman when she finally arrives at the dinner table a little while later. She is Sarah Winchester, the mansion's owner, and she is wearing a black gown. Dr. Price tries to flatter her by praising the fine weaponry produced by her business. Mrs. Winchester, on the other hand, is cynical about the remark and appears to abhor all weapons. The doctor drinks more liquid later that evening, while everyone is asleep, and reflects on his previous chats with Ruby, who turns out to be his late wife. It appears that he gave her a delusional illness diagnosis, as she implored him to accept the veracity of her visions. The doctor is seen playing with a bullet that has the words "together, forever" inscribed on it, and we discover that he was once rescued from a serious gunshot wound. Dr. Price hears a faint voice coming from one of the holes in the panel in his chamber as the clock strikes 12. As he approaches, he starts to hear eerie groans coming from the garden room. He attempts to respond, but he gets no response. He approaches one of the holes to listen, moving closer to it. Unknown to the physician, a pale finger protrudes from the holes, but vanishes as he turns to face it. Following this, the doctor exits his room while still wearing his coat. He approaches the source of the sound, after hearing the faint sounds of a cabinet opening. He then looks into a room, where Sarah Winchester is kneeling and pulling a package out of a cupboard. The doctor swiftly exits the corridor as Sarah turns around and walks into an unidentified adjacent room. Within the room, he hides. He moves closer to the area to explore, when he hears noises suddenly coming from the deeper portion of the room. There, he is startled by a weird young lady who suddenly arrives, causing him to run outdoors. He still doesn't think what he witnessed is true, though. Price turns around, thinking he has to get some air. On the other side of the house, Henry wakes from his slumber upon hearing strange noises of squeaky wheels rolling about. He tries checking under his bed, but finds nothing. Then, out of nowhere, a single roller skate wheel swiftly passes by him out of the bedroom. Henry walks towards it to investigate. Meanwhile, Price slips past the construction workers and tries accessing the garden room from the door by the porch, but to no avail because it is sealed shut. While the doctor tries to look inside, a mysterious figure passes swiftly through the room. He then crosses the front yard, right when he catches the sight of Henry with a bag over his head, slowly walking to the edge. Price panics and runs up to catch him, just as Henry jumps down. He manages to catch the boy, but meets Henry's white eyes, and he says something unpleasant in a low, mature voice. The following morning, Eric meets with Sarah Winchester for the assessment. Mrs. Winchester tells him that she is cursed because she profits off of a business that causes violence and suffering. The doctor, however, remains skeptical. Mrs. Winchester asks him if he believes in ghosts, and he says no. After that, he begins to try to explain to her how the mind can conjure up illusions. Mrs. Winchester, however, is offended by this and proceeds to tell him that his liquid must be confiscated and that he has to abide by her rules while staying in her house. The doctor is escorted back to his room by a butler, complaining about how he is now confined to his quarters in the house. He goes inside his room and opens the pouch where he usually keeps his liquid and finds that it is gone. Irritated, he moves to sit down and opens a letter he found on his desk. It is from the board of directors of the arms company, telling him that they look forward to seeing his assessment. Later that night, the doctor begins making his assessment. He writes that Sarah Winchester appears normal from the outside, but struggles with grief over her husband and daughter's passing, and she acts a little aggressive at times. In addition, she suffers from visual hallucinations of spirits or ghosts, for she claims that she is haunted by the ghosts of people who were slain by the firearms made by her family's company. He attempts to peek out of the window as the huge bell rings at midnight. He can barely see a wandering Mrs. Winchester beyond the construction workers. The woman moves along a corridor while wearing a veil, garbed all in black. The doctor goes out the window out of curiosity and enters another part of the home by slipping past the workmen. He sees a doorway that is just barely open as he peruses the dim hallways further. When he glances inside, he observes Mrs. Winchester sketching the design of what is probably a new room. She had a really weird appearance, like if she were possessed. The room's candles abruptly go out, and Mrs. Winchester quickly uncovers her face. Just in front of Price, a man's disfigured face comes out of nowhere. Then, when he tries to flee, he encounters a string of closed doors that have been nailed shut. As soon as he enters his room, he persuades himself that his hallucinations were caused by withdrawal from liquid and alcohol. The next morning, Dr. Price meets with Mrs. Winchester once again. She starts by inquiring as to what losing one's life feels like. It seems that in the past, the doctor had been shot and had stopped breathing for a full 3 minutes before being revived. He is shown a shelf where Mrs. Winchester keeps a list of every person murdered by a Winchester gun. The doctor shows her a bullet, which he takes out of his pocket and claims it was the one that shot him. He holds it close to himself. Dr. Price replies that he has never seen a ghost. Mrs. Winchester then explains that those who have passed on can see ghosts. Mrs. Winchester claims that she keeps upgrading the home and is creating chambers for spirits with unfinished business because the spirits murdered by the rifle direct her to draw up architectural blueprints. They are summoned by the bell chimes at midnight, and they talk to her through the drawing. She believes that last night, a spirit more violent than any she has ever experienced visited her, and it wants her to recreate the rooms where it passed away. Mrs. Winchester believes her family is at greater risk than ever. Mrs. Winchester and Mr. Hanson, the foreman, are discussing a new room layout. She requests that he ship all variations of the Winchester rifles for the room's exhibit. As the spirits reconcile and go on, Mrs. Winchester says she pulls the rooms apart and rebuilds them for another, all the while building the rooms to their liking, to demonstrate her terrible regret. Sarah describes how 13 nails keep ghosts confined to specific spaces. Henry, who is possessed, tries to shoot Sarah with a rifle, but is prevented by Eric and Marion. Sarah sends her team away after realizing how aggressive this ghost is and makes the decision to get rid of the ghost herself. A butler who meets Eric later discloses that he is actually a ghost. Harry and Sarah recognize the spirit as Benjamin Block, a Confederate States Army soldier who lost both of his brothers to Winchester guns during the American Civil War. Ben, who was upset, then opened fire on the staff inside a Winchester office before being fatally shot by police. Ben was the one who had been controlling Henry. He was murdered in the building's chamber that housed the Winchester rifles. The San Francisco earthquake of 1906 destroys the home and splits Eric and Sarah apart. Henry, who is possessed, runs from his chamber in the middle of the chaos and is chased by Marion. Before seeing the spirit of Ruby, Eric runs across a number of other ghosts. Ruby's ability to see and hear ghosts was discovered, and Eric incorrectly labeled her as delusional. The unstable Ruby shot Eric before shooting herself with a Winchester rifle because she was depressed that he would not believe her. Eric is comforted by Ruby's ghost, who motivates him to assist Sarah. Sarah and Eric reunite, and they successfully catch Ben in the space. Marion and Henry are cornered by Ben's brothers. Ben makes an effort to incapacitate Sarah, but the two learn that he is afraid of the bullet Eric has kept. Because of his prior experience from that gunshot, Eric is able to see the spirits in the home. Ben was shot with a gun, and Eric banishes him with the bullet from that weapon. Henry and Marion are saved, and the other spirits return to their rooms. Sarah is permitted to continue running the business when Eric declares her to be sane. Sarah declares her intention to construct further chambers to assist more ghosts. As the house is being repaired, the camera returns to view the hall of boarded-up rooms and catches a nail falling out of one of the boards that is sealing a spirit. The movie ends with the scene of some of the spirits finally being liberated from their rooms, causing a bigger threat for the house and the Winchester family.